In the harsh winter of 1897, shepherds on the Yorkshire moors walked the ridges with their flocks, guarding against foxes and wildcats. But when sheep began turning up dead, blood-drained, bodies untouched, their search led them to a twisted hawthorn tree and caves whispered about for generations. Inside, they found signs no animal should leave. And when night fell, something began to follow. The men swore the sound of clicking in the dark was not meant for animals at all. Before we continue, please make sure to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means everything. I was 22 years old when the sheep started dying along our northern pasture. My brother Edmund woke me before dawn, and we left the farmhouse with cold tea in our bellies and colder steel in our hands. The sky held a gray band over the moors, our horses breathing mist into the frozen air. The grass was short and stiff with frost. We rode with Mr. Thornton, who owned the estate, and two farmhands, William and Thomas. The dogs stayed behind on their chains because the night before they had frozen at the fence line and refused to cross, hackles raised, whimpering like pups. We followed Blackwater Beck eastward where the limestone broke into ledges and short cliffs. We meant to find whatever was killing the flock and end it swiftly, because the season was lean and our stone walls needed mending before the snows came heavy. The first carcass lay beneath a cluster of gorse bushes. Its body was stiff, the fleece unbroken except for two small holes high on the neck. There was little blood on the ground, perhaps a few drops, no more. Edmund crouched and pressed two fingers above the shoulder. The skin felt cold as marble. He looked up and met my eyes. Something unspoken passed between us. I bent to examine the tracks. The dirt was smooth. No drag marks, no fox prints, nothing from a wildcat. The sheep had run in a tight circle and then stopped, as if they'd given up all at once. Flies were late and few, which I noted but did not say aloud. William crossed himself and muttered the old name for a thing that steals from the fold and leaves no trail. He said there were caves ahead on the south face where the stone folded in on itself. The shepherds on his father's estate had kept away from those folds. They left offerings at a hawthorn with a scarred trunk. He told us the tree still stood. I watched the wind push dust along the beck and said we should keep moving. We found a second sheep near a dry seep. The same punctures, the same clean ground. Thomas spoke too quickly and then stopped himself. He was new to the work and wanted to prove himself, so he offered to ride ahead. Mr. Thornton told him firmly to keep his horse in line. He removed his hat, wiped his brow with a handkerchief, and said we would check the north slope before the temperature dropped further. He kept his voice even, but I knew he felt the same thinness in the air that I felt. It was not silence exactly. It was the way sound carried and then fell short, the way hooves struck the ground without echo beneath certain ledges. I had ridden these moors since childhood, and when a place felt wrong, I could sense it before my mind formed the words. We cut north under the ridge. The limestone showed white edges where spring floods had carved new channels. A carrion crow stood on a fence post and watched us pass. It did not lift its wings or call out, just watched with those black, glittering eyes. Farther on, we reached the scarred hawthorn tree. Ribbons of cloth hung from one twisted branch, faded by weather to pale gray. Dried corn lay in a small clay dish at the base, split by frost. Someone had left a strip of sheep's wool pinned to a thorn. It had hardened and curled like parchment. William said his father had taught him to hang small offerings at the border of bad ground when cattle grew skittish without cause. He said the cave mouth started 200 paces beyond the tree. Edmund looked at me, then looked at the cloth, and said we were not turning back because of old wives' tales. We tied the horses beneath a rock overhang where they could rest in what little shelter there was. They stood quiet at first. After a few minutes, the bay started tossing its head. The dun rolled an eye and stamped, nostrils flaring. Edmund checked their girths and spoke low to calm them. The smell in the air shifted then. It was sharp and stale, not from rot and not from urine. I had never smelled it on any hunt. It reminded me of a bucket of blood left in the sun and then cooled, metallic and heavy, without a sour edge. I kept the thought to myself and shouldered my rifle. The first cave mouth was narrow, just wide enough for a grown man to pass with his shoulders turned. The stone around it was smooth where water had run for years, then rough where it had broken free in chunks. We found no droppings. No owl pellets. No sign of bats roosting. A scatter of small bones lay near the entrance, clean and light, mostly birds. A few rodents. One lamb's skull no bigger than my palm. The bones were not chewed. Some had neat punctures that had marked the thin plates and left them cracked without splinters. It was as if something had pierced them with precision, extracting what it needed and leaving the rest. Thomas swallowed hard and asked who was carrying the lanterns. We had 2 old tin lanterns with fresh oil and a bundle of kindling. I gave one lantern to William and kept the other. Edmund checked his revolver and nodded at me. We did not enter yet. We walked the line of the ridge to mark every opening. We counted 11 mouths along that face, some as small as a boot, one large enough for a carriage if the ground had allowed it. The large mouth sat beneath a tilted shelf of stone. The air that moved out of it felt cool and dry, like the breath of something vast and sleeping. A sheep trail skirted past it and dropped into the beck below. The ground around the mouth held a crust that broke into powder beneath a boot. Mr. Thornton knelt and ran his hand across it. He held up a flake to the lantern light. It caught the flame with a faint gloss, like dried egg white. He said it looked like dried albumin, old blood perhaps. He did not press the point. He simply placed the flake back on the ground and stood. As we walked, small details pressed at the edges of my attention. A lizard lay dead on a flat rock with no wound. A line of ants had crossed toward it and then turned back, leaving a gap in their path. A cicada shell hung from a blade of grass near the largest cave and crumbled when the breeze touched it. None of these facts stood alone, but together they said the same thing the sheep had said when they circled and froze. The land was holding itself differently around those mouths. And the animals had learned to fear it. I wanted to tell Edmund in a way that would not sound like cowardice. I said plainly, we should start at the smallest opening and work our way up. And we should mark our path with cord and chalk. He agreed at once, which told me he felt it too. We lit the lanterns. The oil caught, the wicks drew flame, and the light stood steady against the growing dusk. Mr. Thornton made a quick decision. We would explore 3 of the caves before nightfall, no more. If we found a den, we would test fire and smoke before doing anything rash. William took the chalk and made a mark on the right side of the first entrance. He tied cord to a rock outside and fed the line in as I crawled forward. The passage ran 3 body lengths and opened into a pocket no larger than a water barrel. The air inside held the same stale, metallic edge. I held the lantern high and turned slowly. The walls bore fine scratches in clustered groups, pairs and trios, always at the same height above the floor. They were not claw marks from any cat I knew. They were close together, precise, almost methodical. I traced one set with my finger. The stone felt dry and cold as ice. I called back that there was nothing alive inside. Edmund said to come out. I backed out carefully, shielding the lantern glass from the stone. We moved to the next opening. It ran only 2 paces and ended in a plug of fallen rock. We marked it with chalk and kept going. The 5th opening ran deep at a downward slope. We set a second cord tied to a second rock and stepped down one at a time, our boots ringing on the hard floor. The light picked out small piles of pellets in one corner. They were not from sheep, not from rabbits. They were too regular, not like any droppings I had seen. Each pellet had a faint dark center, almost like a seed. I did not touch them. The chamber held a sour trace that stung my throat when I breathed through my mouth. We stood in silence and listened. The sound in there was low and rhythmic, not wind, not water. It was the shuffle of air through channels we could not see, coming and going without pattern. When we emerged, the horses had pulled their reins tight. Foam stood at the bay's bit. Thomas went to them and stroked their necks until the sweat lay flat again. He looked at me, then down at the ground. He wanted to say he was ready to leave. He did not say it. Instead, he picked up the coil of cord and asked where next, his voice steadier than before. That was good. Fear that goes quiet can hold a line. Panic that speaks keeps speaking. We reached the large mouth near midday. The cold on my back met the cool air from within and set a hard edge across my skin. I held the lantern forward and saw the stone drop into a wide chamber. The floor showed marks, shallow and many. They crossed and layered, all pointing toward the deeper tunnels. They were not boot marks. They were not hoof marks. They were small and paired, repeated in measured steps, like the gait of something that walked on four legs but placed each foot with intention. My chest tightened. Edmund said to wait. He walked back to the hawthorn tree and returned with the clay dish and the strip of wool. He set them at the side of the entrance without ceremony, only with care. He said nothing while he did it. When he finished, he looked at me and nodded once. I nodded back. We ate cold mutton and bread beneath the overhang. No one said much. Mr. Thornton unfolded a survey map of the estate and laid a small stone on each corner. He drew 11 small crosses where the cave mouths ran and circled the largest. He said we would go no more than 2 chambers deep in any tunnel, and only farther in the large one because it gave us space to stand and turn. If we found a den, we would test fire and smoke before acting rashly. William said he would carry the kindling and oil. Thomas checked his belt knife, sheathed it, and drank from his canteen. Edmund loosened his shoulders and rolled his wrists the way he did before breaking a young horse. He glanced at me once, as if to measure how steady my eyes were. I held his gaze without flinching. We rose and walked to the large mouth. The air that came from inside carried that same metallic trace, and beneath it another layer I had not caught before, a faint sweet note that turned bitter a moment later, like fruit gone to rot. I lifted the lantern and saw the first chamber open ahead, with 3 exit tunnels at the far wall. The ceiling hung low near the middle and rose at the sides. The floor tilted slightly downward toward the right. I told them to watch the tilt. They nodded. We stepped inside and let the light sweep across the stone. We stood silent, listening for anything that breathed or moved. The only sound was that slow, irregular movement of air through passages beyond our sight. We walked forward in a careful line, and the light reached the far wall. That was when I saw it. At knee height, near the right-hand tunnel, there was a smear of fresh wetness on the stone, thin and dark. Above it, 2 neat holes punctured the rock itself, as if something had driven sharp points into the limestone with great force. My jaw set. I raised a hand to stop the line. We had found where the trail led. Edmund moved beside me and steadied the lantern with his palm beneath mine. William set the kindling bundle down near the entrance and kept the oil tin in his coat pocket. Mr. Thornton crouched by the smear and studied the 2 holes without touching them. He raised his eyes to me, then to the right-hand tunnel. His look asked a simple question. I nodded. He told Thomas to pay out the second cord. William marked the wall with 3 short chalk strokes. We stepped into the right-hand tunnel in single file. The air cooled further. The floor tilted more steeply. The lantern flames stood steady, which meant there was little airflow here. A dead end, perhaps, or something blocking the passage ahead. The stone on the walls bore the same grouped scratches at a fixed height. I noted that they were fresh in some places and old in others. The old ones had a faint powder in them that came off on the tip of my finger when I touched it. We moved 20 paces and reached a bend that hid what lay beyond. I lifted my hand to stop the line. We listened. There was a soft movement ahead, not steady, not rhythmic. Short sounds, spaced irregularly. We rounded the bend. The tunnel opened into a low chamber, no taller than a man. The floor held a litter of broken bones in small pieces, more bird and rodent than sheep. At the far wall lay a fresh lamb, intact, eyes still open, body still flexible. 2 neat punctures marked its neck. There was no pool of blood beneath it. Edmund checked the flank with 2 fingers. He drew his hand back and shook his head once. William swallowed but said nothing. Thomas set the cord over a rock and kept the slack ready in his hands. Mr. Thornton moved his lantern slowly along the floor. The small pieces of bone had been arranged in thin arcs near the wall, deliberate and precise. He nudged one with his boot. It rolled but held its curve. He did not push further. We stood in that chamber long enough for the air to feel stale and oppressive. I wanted to test smoke here to see how it moved, to understand if there was ventilation or if we were standing in a sealed tomb. William opened the oil tin and wetted a strip of kindling, then twisted it tight. I lit it from the lantern and held it near the floor, then at shoulder height. The smoke rose, drifted toward the left side of the chamber, and slipped into a narrow seam I had not noticed before. I set the kindling on the ground and watched. The smoke thinned and vanished into the seam completely. The seam was no wider than 2 fingers, but it ran upward and toward the back of the cave system. Edmund pointed at it silently. We marked the seam with chalk for later reference and backed out. I did not want to wedge my hands into a place I could not see or escape from. We returned to the first large chamber and took the middle exit. The floor in the middle tunnel showed more of those paired steps. They overlapped and led inward, deeper into the earth. I began to notice where the pairs spread apart for a moment and then came together again, as if the stride had changed on uneven rock, or as if whatever made them had paused to examine something. The tunnel sloped down in a shallow grade. The smell shifted to that faint sweet note, stronger here and more complex. I placed it somewhere between dried blood and plant resin, with a bitter chemical edge. William wiped his forearm across his face. Despite the cool air, I felt sweat gather beneath my shirt. The middle tunnel opened into a high chamber with a flat floor. The ceiling lifted enough that we could stand without bending. There were 3 alcoves cut into the far wall, evenly spaced, each one deep enough to hold a man. In the first alcove lay a set of bones that were not from any sheep or rabbit. They were long, with joint shapes I had seen only on larger predators, wolves perhaps, or hunting dogs. The skull had flat teeth in front and pointed teeth farther back, worn and chipped. 2 small round holes punctured the thin bone near the base of the skull. In the second alcove lay woven grass, dry and gray, arranged in a shallow bowl. The grass had been braided into bands and then crossed to make a base, precise and deliberate. It was not the work of wind or water. In the third alcove lay a pile of thin hides, not tanned, dried hard, cut into strips of equal width. Each strip had small punctures in a row near one end, as if something had run a tool through them for fastening or binding. Thomas stood at the edge of the lantern light and did not enter the alcoves. His right hand rested on his belt knife. His jaw worked silently. He had stopped speaking, and that was fine with me. Mr. Thornton knelt near the woven base and inspected it without touching. He kept his hands on his knees and took in the braid pattern, the way it had been crossed and secured. He looked at me and said in a low voice that a person had done this, or something with hands. He did not ask a question. He stated a fact. I nodded once. Edmund stepped closer to the strips of hide and counted them. There were 9 strips, each the length of a man's forearm, each pierced at the same interval. He stepped back again without touching them. William spoke then, his voice barely above a whisper. He said his father had told him about caves where a thing gathered tools the way a person gathers tools. He had not believed him. Until now. We searched the rest of the chamber with growing unease. The floor near the center had shallow depressions in a rough ring. They were not footprints in any way I recognized. They were areas where the stone had been polished to a dull sheen, round and shallow, the size of a man's palm. At the edge of the ring stood 3 short stone stacks, 6 stones each, balanced without mortar or clay. We did not touch them. The lantern light made the edges sharp and unnatural. I stepped around them carefully and kept my breathing even. A new sound came then from the passage opposite the way we had entered. It was a short exhalation followed by a dry rasp, like claws on stone. The sound stopped. It came again, then moved, closer. I raised my rifle and held the lantern out to the side to keep the glare from my eyes. Edmund lifted his revolver. William set the oil tin down and gripped the kindling bundle with both hands. Thomas kept the cord taut without pulling hard. Mr. Thornton moved 2 steps to his left to clear a line of fire for his shotgun. We stood in a shallow arc, weapons ready. The shape appeared at the far edge of the light. It was low and narrow, gray on gray, almost invisible against the stone. It held perfectly still and watched us. Eyes reflected the lantern light, pale green, set wide apart. The head was wedge-shaped, not broad like a dog or wolf. There was a ridge of hard nubs along its back that ran from the neck to the hips, like armored plates. The front limbs were longer than the rear, with joints that bent in a way that put the weight forward, like a hunting stance. The paws ended in 2 main claws with a smaller inner one, sharp and curved. The mouth was narrow, with small pointed teeth close together, visible when it opened slightly to breathe. When it moved, it did not scrape the stone. It placed each paw deliberately and lifted it with precision, like a craftsman working with fine tools. It stopped at the edge of the ring of polished stone and lowered its head. The smell grew stronger, that sweet, bitter trace bit at the back of my throat. Thomas exhaled sharply through his nose. The sound broke the stillness. The creature lifted its head and drew air through its mouth. The lips pulled back without a snarl, revealing those small, needle-like teeth. No sound followed, only the movement of breath. I heard the leather creak on Edmund's holster. He did not fire. He waited for Mr. Thornton's command. The paws held, stretching like a wire about to snap. The creature took one step to the left, then right, then forward one pace. It did not enter the ring. It stayed precisely at the edge, as if the ring marked a boundary it would not cross. It turned its head toward the third alcove, the one with the hide strips, and then back to us. It lowered its head again and held perfectly still. I spoke in a low voice, forcing calm into my words. We will back toward the entrance. Slowly. Keep the line intact. Do not show it our backs. Keep the lantern between us and it. Mr. Thornton agreed with a single word, aye. We stepped backward one pace at a time. The creature followed our movement by turning its head, tracking us with those pale green eyes. It did not step forward. It simply watched. When we reached the mouth of the tunnel we had used to enter, it moved 2 paces toward the center of the chamber, just to the edge of the ring, no farther. It lowered its head and exhaled slowly. I smelled that bitter trace again, stronger now. It turned and moved to the third alcove. It took one strip of hide in its front claws with a quick, precise grip and set the strip across its 4 limbs like a harness or yoke. It held still for 3 breaths, as if displaying itself to us. Then it turned its head toward us again. We did not fire. We moved into the tunnel and walked backward until the chamber narrowed into the passage. When we reached the bend, we turned and moved faster, though not running. The cord slid through Thomas's trembling hands. The chalk marks on the wall passed in a rhythm that steadied my breathing, gave me something to count. At the last turn before the first chamber, I heard a new sound from behind. It was not breath. It was a light tapping, spaced evenly, 2 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, like something striking stone with intention. Edmund looked at me. I looked at Mr. Thornton. He nodded grimly. We did not run. We maintained our pace, controlled and deliberate. We reached the first chamber and faced the 3 exit tunnels. The tapping stopped. We gathered at the center and took a quick count. Everyone was present. I said we would fall back to the mouth and reassess our position. As we crossed the large chamber, my boots slid on the crust near the entrance. I caught myself and looked down. The crust had fresh marks in it, pairs, the same spacing as in the tunnels. But these led not into the cave, but toward the outside. I raised my lantern and held it toward the mouth. Daylight made a shallow line on the floor. The marks went to that line and stopped. We stepped into the open air one by one, shielding the lanterns from the harsh daylight. The horses stood with heads high and ears forward, their reins pulled taut. The bay's chest heaved with rapid breaths. Thomas went to them immediately and spoke in soothing tones. The dun struck the ground once with its hoof and then settled. I checked the sky and the line of the ridge. The day had moved on. Afternoon shadows stretched across the moor. I looked back into the cave mouth. Cool air still moved outward. The smell reached only to the edge, as if held back by an invisible barrier. We pulled back to the rock overhang and set the lanterns down on flat stone. No one spoke for several long moments. Then Mr. Thornton said plainly that we had seen enough to confirm this was more than foxes or wildcats. He said we would not leave the flock here to be taken. He said we would attempt to seal the main entrance by nightfall and mark the smaller mouths for later action. William suggested we could build a fire at the mouth and test smoke to drive whatever was inside deeper into the caves. Edmund pointed out that the seam in the first side chamber had drawn smoke, which meant there was a network deeper in the system that we did not understand, perhaps multiple exits we had not found. Thomas asked the question that had been hanging in the air: was it one creature that had made those marks, or more than one? I looked at the paired steps in the crust, thought about the strips of hide and the woven base in the alcove. I said I had not seen more than one at a time, but the arrangement in the chamber had not been made in a single night. It suggested intelligence, planning, perhaps even ritual. We agreed to gather brush and dry wood from the beck and feed a slow, smoky fire at the entrance to carry smoke inward. We would watch for other exits. We would tie fresh cord across each smaller opening to see if anything broke through. We would keep 2 men with the horses to steady them and to ride for help if anything emerged. We moved at once. We did not leave anyone alone. We worked quickly without raising our voices. The sun stood high but would not hold for long. Winter days were short, and I felt the hours narrowing as our tasks multiplied. I kept my hands busy and my mind on each step. The sheep in the northern pasture would not survive another night of this. We cut hawthorn and juniper branches from the beck floor, stripping them down to dry lengths. William broke the brush into smaller pieces for kindling whilst Edmund gathered heavier limbs. Thomas kept glancing nervously at the ridge. He said nothing, but every time his head turned, his hands stayed near the knife on his belt. Mr. Thornton bound the branches into 2 bundles with cord, and we carried them up to the large mouth. The air pushing out of the cave remained steady, cool against the heat of our exertion. The smell clung there, sharper now, as if our earlier presence had stirred something inside, awakened it from slumber. We laid the brush in a low heap across the entrance and poured oil along the base. William struck flint until sparks caught the kindling. He fed the flame carefully, guiding it under the brush until it spread and caught properly. The fire took quickly, low and dark, with thick smoke that coiled and pressed inward against the draft. We stood in silence as it rolled into the darkness. The horses down below grew restless again, tossing their heads and snorting with alarm. Thomas called out that they were pulling hard at the reins. Mr. Thornton sent him back to settle them, and Edmund went as well. The 2 men stood at the horses' sides, speaking low and stroking their necks whilst the fire smoldered on. At first, the smoke slid inward without resistance. Then it slowed, and I watched as the flow shifted subtly. The smoke began to push back toward us. A faint draft, like a slow breath from within, forced the smoke outward. The fire burned lower under the weight of that opposing pressure. William threw more kindling on, and the flames rose higher, but the smoke still met resistance. It spread across the mouth, circled back on itself, and hung low in the air. Mr. Thornton's jaw set hard. "The chambers inside are breathing against us," he said quietly. A sharp noise broke through the air then, a dry click echoing from inside the stone. It came in pairs, measured and deliberate, like the tapping we had heard before. But louder now. Closer. Edmund and Thomas looked up sharply from the horses. The sound repeated, moving nearer, then stopped abruptly. The smoke at the mouth shifted again, pulled back suddenly into the darkness. The draft drew hard inward, as if something had opened a passage deep inside, a throat inhaling. The fire crackled violently. Sparks rushed forward. The heap of brush leaned toward the cave as if being pulled by invisible hands. Mr. Thornton raised his shotgun and stepped forward. I lifted my rifle beside him. We stood tight at the edge of the entrance, weapons ready, waiting for movement. The air stilled. The smoke thinned. Nothing emerged. We did not lower our weapons. The quiet held for far too long, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Then the base screamed and reared violently, snapping its rein against the rock overhang. Edmund shouted and pulled it down with both hands, barely holding the line. Thomas pointed past the beck, his arm shaking. Across the slope, near one of the smaller mouths we had marked with chalk, the cord we had tied sagged loose. It had been cut clean through. No fray, no strain, only severed. We ran to the smaller opening together, leaving William to keep the fire burning at the main entrance. When we reached the opening, the cord lay on the ground in 2 neat halves. The chalk mark on the stone bore a new scratch through it, fresh and pale, as if something had deliberately defaced our marker. The tunnel inside was pitch black. The air carried that same sweet, metallic odor, now mixed with something else, something organic and living. Edmund crouched low, studying the severed cord. "It was not chewed," he said quietly. The ends are too clean. He held the two pieces up to the fading light. They looked as if they had been sliced with a sharp blade or tool. Mr. Thornton said nothing for a long moment, his face gray as ash. Then he spoke, flat and firm. We will not wait for night to close around us. We will attempt to seal every opening with stone and brush, now, before anything else comes through. He gave orders quickly and clearly. William would continue feeding the fire at the main entrance. Edmund and I would carry stones from the beck to the smaller mouths and stack them as barricades. Thomas would stay with the horses, ready to ride for help if something broke through our defenses. Mr. Thornton would move between positions, watching all approaches. We worked with desperate speed. The sun beat down hard despite the winter cold. Sweat ran into our eyes, stinging and blinding. We hauled flat stones and stacked them against the narrow mouths, filling gaps with brush and packed earth. The smoke at the large entrance thickened again, drifting out in heavy puffs that hung low across the frozen ground. William coughed violently but did not step back. He threw more kindling and kept the flame as hot as he could manage. When we sealed the third small mouth, Edmund wiped his brow with a shaking hand and muttered, "It feels like we're piling sticks against a flood." His voice carried strain but not doubt. I told him plainly that we had to keep trying. There was no other choice. Half an hour passed in hard labor. Then the first barricade collapsed. A crash sounded from the far end of the ridge where we had blocked one of the tighter openings. Dust lifted into the cold air, and a section of stacked rock rolled down the slope with a terrible clatter. We ran to it, hearts pounding. The brush we had wedged into the gap had been pushed from inside with considerable force. It lay scattered downhill, torn and broken. Among the debris, we found 2 strips of sheep's hide, fresh and wet with blood, laid neatly across the toppled stones in a deliberate cross pattern. Thomas swore under his breath and gripped his horse's reins tighter. The animal turned in frantic circles, foam gathering at its lips. Mr. Thornton stared at the strips of hide for a long moment, then turned to face all of us. His voice was steady but final. "We are wasting our strength trying to hold this ridge. Whatever is inside knows every turn of these tunnels. They will emerge where we least expect them. Our efforts are only marking ourselves as targets." He ordered us to gather the horses immediately and drive the flock south by nightfall, away from this cursed ground entirely. His tone left no space for argument or discussion. Edmund looked as if he wanted to speak, to argue for standing our ground, but he closed his mouth and nodded. William doused the fire with earth, though smoke continued to seep from the stones like breath from a dying man. The cave mouths along the ridge exhaled faint wisps of that bittersweet odor, stronger now than before, as if whatever was inside had grown more active, more aware of our presence. We loaded what equipment we could onto the horses, tied off the rest, and began leading them down toward the beck. The sun tilted low on the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the scrubland, reaching toward us like grasping fingers. The sheep in the northern pasture bleated faintly in the distance, restless and afraid, as if they sensed the air itself had changed. The ridge behind us stayed quiet, but I felt the weight of eyes pressing on my back, watching, measuring, waiting. I walked at the rear of our group, rifle gripped in both hands, turning often to check the slope behind us. Each time I looked back, the cave mouth seemed darker, wider, as if the stone itself was watching us retreat. Hungering. We did not speak much as we moved southward. Our boots scuffed dust into the dry air. The flock bleated constantly, pressing against each other, their nerves running through them like electricity. I thought of the bones in the alcove, the woven grass, the strips of hide pierced for fastening. I thought of the tapping, the measured breath, the way the creature had held back at the ring of polished stone, as if respecting a boundary we did not understand. My jaw clenched tight. We were leaving, retreating. But I knew with absolute certainty that this was not finished. We would be watched. Perhaps followed. Perhaps tested again once darkness fell completely. The first stars appeared faint above the ridge as we drove the sheep southward across the open moorland. By the time the flock reached the southern pasture, the sky had turned deep indigo and the first bats wheeled overhead in their evening hunt. We penned the sheep inside a crude corral of split timber posts and thorny brush. The animals pressed together uneasily, their eyes catching the lantern light with a dull, fearful sheen. Thomas tied the last gate shut and leaned heavily against the post, his breath coming in short gasps. Edmund and I unrolled our blankets near the fence, keeping our rifles within easy reach. William built a low fire, stacking hawthorn branches so it would burn slowly through the long night ahead. Mr. Thornton walked the perimeter with his shotgun balanced in his arms, each step deliberate and measured, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our small circle of light. We ate little cold beans from a tin, a strip of dried mutton each, and water from our canteens that tasted of metal and fear. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes, mixing with the sheep musk and our own sweat. My ears kept searching for sounds beyond the nervous shifting of the flock, coyotes, owls, anything normal. But the night gave back only the shuffling of hooves and the creak of timber. Thomas muttered that he could not shake the feeling we had carried something back with us from those caves. He said the horses still pulled at their ropes, heads turning constantly toward the northern ridge, though we were miles from it now. Edmund told him sharply to be quiet and save his voice for when it truly mattered. Still, his own eyes never left the dark line of hills to the north. Near midnight, the sheep stirred in sudden unison, their bleats sharp and panicked. They pressed so hard against one side of the corral that the timber posts groaned under the strain. Edmund and I ran to the fence, pushing them back with the butts of our rifles, trying to restore order. Then I heard it clearly. A faint clicking sound, 2 beats followed by a pause, carrying across the open moorland like a signal. It came again, measurably closer. The sheep screamed louder, a sound I had never heard from them before, pure terror given voice. William threw fresh brush on the fire and the flames leapt higher, casting wild shadows across the frozen ground. Mr. Thornton raised his hand sharply for silence. We all froze, barely breathing, listening with every fiber of our being. The clicking stopped abruptly. In its place came a thin whistle, almost like air squeezed through a reed pipe, wavering and short, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost like speech. The entire flock went silent as if every sheep were holding its breath simultaneously. The fire crackled once, sending sparks spiraling upward into the black sky. Then the whistle cut off sharply. The quiet that followed felt like a physical weight pressing against my ears, against my chest. Mr. Thornton whispered hoarsely that we would hold this position until dawn broke. He ordered 2 men awake at all times, one near the flock, one near the horses. Edmund and I took the first watch. Thomas curled on his blanket near the fire, though I seriously doubted he would find any sleep tonight. I walked the fence slowly, lantern held low to avoid blinding myself. The sheep's eyes followed my movement, glinting like scattered coins. Beyond the corral, the land stretched open, low grass and scattered hawthorn trees, their twisted branches black against the stars. The ridge was a line of deeper darkness against the northern horizon. Nothing moved out there that I could see. Still, I could not escape the overwhelming sense of weight, of being watched from that direction, studied and assessed. Edmund sat with his back to the fire, revolver resting on his knee, eyes fixed unwaveringly on the darkness beyond our light. He said nothing until I completed my circuit and returned to his position. Then he spoke, his voice flat and distant. I saw those hide strips in my dreams once before. Years ago, when we were children. I had a fever that nearly killed me. I woke with marks on my arm that looked like punctures, 2 small holes. I never told anyone. He stared into the darkness and said nothing more. I did not know how to respond, so I simply stood beside him in silence. An hour crawled past like something wounded. The fire burned lower, the air growing colder. I rubbed my hands together for warmth and bent to add more brush to the flames. That was when I heard it again. A scraping sound, stone on stone, deliberate and rhythmic, far off but unmistakable. Edmund heard it too. We raised our weapons simultaneously and turned our eyes northward. The sound came again, closer this time. The sheep pressed back from the northern fence, their bodies trembling. Mr. Thornton rose from his blanket without a word and joined us, shotgun at the ready. William grabbed the oil tin and poured a generous amount into the fire. The flames surged upward, lighting the pasture bright as day for a few precious seconds. For that brief moment, Nothing showed itself. Then, along the distant slope of the ridge, I saw movement. 3 shapes emerged from the largest cave mouth, their bodies low to the ground, moving with that same deliberate, measured gait. Their eyes caught the firelight from impossible distance, pale green sparks in the darkness. Thomas woke with a strangled gasp. He stumbled to his feet, knife trembling in his hand like a leaf in wind. Edmund whispered urgently for him to stay calm and steady. The shapes did not charge toward us. Instead, they paced along the ridge in a line, their clicking sounds carrying across the moor like drumbeats, measured, intentional, communicating something we could not understand. One stopped and lowered its head toward our position, perfectly still for several heartbeats. Then it turned aside, moving parallel to the ridge rather than toward us. Another crouched low, its claws gripping the stone with visible strength even from this distance. The third lifted something in its front limbs. I could just make out its silhouette against the stars. It caught the firelight briefly, a strip of hide, long and swaying like a banner. The creature draped it across its limbs in that same deliberate gesture we had witnessed in the chamber, like a harness, like a display, like a ritual we were not meant to comprehend. Then all 3 vanished back into the darkness with terrible swiftness and silence. The flock erupted into chaos again, bleeding and kicking, their panic infectious and overwhelming. We pressed them back until the corral held, though the timber groaned and threatened to give way. My chest hammered with each ragged breath. Mr. Thornton spoke at last, his voice steady despite what we had just witnessed. We cannot outrun them or outlast them. If they are showing themselves now, openly, they want us to know something. They are making a statement. He told us that at first light we would drive the flock even farther south, past the river crossing, into the valley beyond, even if the land there was poor and offered little grazing. He said this moorland was no longer ground fit for men or animals. His words carried the weight of absolute finality. We maintained our watch until the first gray light touched the eastern horizon. The sheep sagged with exhaustion, and so did we. None of us spoke again of the 3 shapes we had seen on the ridge, but we all carried the memory in our eyes, in the way we moved, in the silence that hung between us like fog. We broke camp as quickly as our exhausted bodies would allow, packed our meager belongings, and began driving the depleted flock southward once more. The land opened wider, and in the distance I could see the river glimmering faintly in the dawn light. The farther we moved from the ridge, the easier the sheep walked. Their distressed bleating softened to something more normal, almost peaceful. The horses steadied as well, their heads lowering, their breathing evening out. The terrible smell that had clung to us, that sweet, metallic bitterness, faded gradually from the air. Still, when I turned to look back one final time, the ridge sat black and brooding against the pale sky, silent and watchful. Waiting. I knew with absolute certainty that we had not escaped it permanently. We had only moved beyond its immediate reach for a time. The question was not if it would follow again, but when. By midday we reached the river. Its water ran shallow and brown with winter sediment, but it marked a clear boundary between the northern moorland and the valley pastures beyond. Mr. Thornton chose a rise above the far bank for the flock, a stretch of grass thin and frost-burned, but safer than anywhere we had been in days. The sheep settled faster than I had dared hope, lowering their heads to graze on what little fodder remained. Their bleats had returned to normal sounds, complaints about the cold and the poor grass, not the screams of pure terror we had heard the night before. The horses drank deeply from the river and stood calmer, their eyes no longer rolling with fear. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the air felt open and clean, without that oppressive trace of something watching from the darkness. I desperately wanted to believe that distance would be enough, that we had truly left that cursed ground behind us. Yet every time I closed my eyes, even for a moment, I saw those shapes on the ridge. I saw the way one had lifted that strip of hide like it was displaying something to us, showing us its nature, its intelligence, its claim to that territory. We built a new fire on the rise above the river. William fetched more wood from the scrub willows near the water's edge, moving carefully, still jumpy despite the apparent safety. Thomas tended the flock, checking hooves for damage and reinforcing the makeshift fence lines we had constructed from whatever materials we could find. Edmund and I refilled our canteens at the water, our eyes constantly scanning the northern horizon, unable to fully relax despite the distance we had put between ourselves and those caves. Mr. Thornton sat on a flat stone and studied his estate map once more, tracing a line southward with his thumb, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He said we would continue moving the flock in careful stages until we reached his cousin's land near the village of Ashford, far beyond these haunted hills, in country where the land was known and the darkness held no such secrets. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried absolute determination. He would not risk losing his entire estate to whatever lived in those limestone caves. Better to abandon good grazing land than to lose everything to an enemy we could neither understand nor defeat. Through the long afternoon, the land stayed mercifully quiet. We took turns resting, though none of us managed anything approaching real sleep. Each time I drifted toward unconsciousness, a sound in the grass jerked me awake, a lizard's scuttling tail, a locust's sudden flight, a sheep's abrupt call. My nerves were stretched thin as wire. Edmund stayed restless as well, sitting upright with his rifle across his knees, sharpening his knife repeatedly until the edge gleamed like glass in the winter sunlight. At one point he said, almost to himself, that he had felt something brush against his leg when we were leaving the ridge that final time. Not a claw or tooth, just a weight, like a hand steadying itself against him. Like something testing him, measuring him. He looked at me then with haunted eyes and shook his head, as if the words should never have left his mouth, as if speaking them made them more real. I said nothing, but I believed him completely. Toward evening, clouds rolled in from the west in great dark masses. The light grew dim and the air turned heavy with the promise of rain or snow. A storm was gathering. We worked with renewed urgency to secure the flock inside our crude corral, using whatever cut branches and rope we could spare to reinforce the structure. Thunder rolled low across the valley, echoing off distant hills. Then the rain began. First in scattered drops, then in driving sheets that drenched the ground and sent rivulets running toward the swollen river. The sheep huddled together for warmth, their fleeces darkening with water. The horses pulled at their tethers but did not panic, standing with their heads low against the storm. I lifted my face to the rain, grateful beyond words to smell only wet earth and winter grass. Clean smells. Natural smells. But then, underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, that old trace returned. That sweet metallic edge with its bitter chemical finish. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I told Edmund quietly that I could smell it again, and he nodded without hesitation or surprise. He smelled it too. The thing had followed us across miles of open moorland and a river crossing. It had not given up its hunt. That night we kept the fire blazing high despite the rain, feeding it with whatever dry wood we had kept covered beneath our canvas sheets. The flock bleated intermittently, disturbed by the storm's violence and by something else we could feel but not name. The thunder masked smaller sounds, but now and then, in the brief silences between rumbles, I heard them clearly. Clicks. Soft at first, almost inaudible beneath the rain's drumming, then sharper, more deliberate. 2 beats and a pause, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. They came from across the river, from the near bank we had abandoned hours before. I raised the lantern high, its light struggling against the storm's darkness, and peered into the sheeting rain. I saw nothing but dripping willows and churning water. Still, the clicking continued, 2 beats and a pause, again and again, steady and patient as death itself. Thomas swore viciously under his breath and gripped his knife with white knuckles. William asked shakily if we should fire a warning shot to drive them away. Mr. Thornton shook his head firmly. We will not waste powder shooting at shadows and rain. We hold this ground until dawn, and then we move again. The storm eased near midnight, the rain slowing to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. Mist rose from the wet ground in thick curtains, curling low over the pasture and the river both, obscuring everything beyond 20 paces. The firelight threw our shadows long and distorted across the white mist, making us look like giants or monsters. Edmund and I stood guard along the corral's northern fence, our weapons ready, our eyes straining to pierce the fog. Through the shifting veils of mist, I saw movement. Low shapes, deliberate and purposeful, slipping through the grass beyond the river. One at first, then another, then two more, then more still. They did not cross the water immediately. They stayed on the far bank, pacing back and forth in a line, watching us with those pale green eyes that reflected our firelight like distant stars. One crouched low and tapped its claws deliberately against a flat stone at the water's edge. The sound carried across the river like a drum, sharp and rhythmic and terrifyingly intelligent. The others froze in place and lowered their heads as if listening to instructions, as if receiving commands. Then they all rose as one and vanished silently back into the mist, leaving no trace of their presence except that sound still echoing in my mind. When dawn finally broke the next morning, gray and cold, the flock was still miraculously intact. No sheep had been taken in the night. Relief spread through us like warm water, though no one smiled or celebrated. We broke camp immediately and drove the flock farther south without discussion or debate. The land here stretched wide and relatively flat, safer ground, known ground, but the unease clung to us like our rain-soaked clothes. Each mile we traveled put more distance between ourselves and that cursed ridge, yet with every backward glance I half expected to see those shapes pacing behind us in the mist. For 3 more days we traveled steadily southward. The sheep grew gradually calmer with each mile, their natural rhythms slowly returning. The horses settled back into their normal gait, no longer constantly on edge. Thomas even laughed once when one of the young lambs head-butted him playfully in the leg. A normal, ordinary moment that felt like a miracle after days of horror. I wanted desperately to believe we had truly outrun it this time, that we had escaped. But on the 4th night, as we camped beneath a stand of ancient oak trees, I woke to find Edmund sitting bolt upright in his blankets, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond our fire. I asked him quietly what had disturbed him. He said he had dreamed of the alcove again, the woven grass, the strips of hide laid out in precise patterns. Only this time, in the dream, the strips had been laid across his own chest like a funeral shroud or a yoke of ownership. He swore he could still feel the weight of them when he woke, pressing down on his ribs, making it difficult to breathe. He pressed his hand to his shirt as he spoke, his fingers trembling. His skin was damp, not with sweat from exertion or fever, but with something colder, something that carried that faint metallic smell. He did not speak again until morning came, just sat there in the darkness, watching and waiting for something none of us could name. At sunrise we moved on once more, driven by fear we could not fully articulate. The land ahead promised better pasture, safe ground far from those limestone caves and their terrible inhabitants. Yet the knowledge had settled deep in all our bones now, inescapable and permanent. We had seen what most men only speak of in frightened whispers around late-night fires. We had seen something that should not exist, yet undeniably does. We had carried our flock away from that place, preserved most of the animals through sheer determination and luck. But the caves still waited in the northern moorland, dark and breathing. And the things within them, whatever they truly were, had watched us leave without trying to stop us with violence. They had simply let us go. That thought weighed heavier than any direct attack would have, because it meant they were confident. It meant they knew we would never truly escape, never truly be free of them. They had marked us somehow, claimed us in ways we did not yet understand. We had been measured and assessed and found, what? Worthy? Useful? Entertaining? We did not know, and that ignorance was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. We reached the village of Ashford by the end of that week, our flock thinned from the brutal march but alive against all odds. Mr. Thornton's cousin met us at the edge of his land, a weathered man named George Hartley, who had already heard rumors of our troubles even before we arrived. Word of dead sheep drained of blood had traveled quickly through the valley, carried by merchants and wandering laborers, growing more exaggerated with each telling. George gave us water and salt and bread, then asked directly what we had seen up on those northern moors. Mr. Thornton hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. He did not speak of the shapes or the hide strips or the woven grass. He only said that the flock had been stalked by something that was neither wolf nor wildcat, and that the limestone caves in that particular ridge should never be entered by any man who valued his life or his sanity. George pressed him for more details, hungry for a proper story, but Mr. Thornton cut him short with unusual sharpness. He said it was enough that we had escaped with most of our animals and our lives. Some knowledge, he implied, was too dangerous to share openly. We rested the depleted flock on George's good pasture land. The sheep spread out gratefully into the grass, heads lowering to graze properly for the first time in over a week. Their ribs showed prominently from the forced march and the terror they had endured. We washed ourselves in the cold stream that ran through George's property, scrubbing away days of sweat and smoke and fear. We mended our tack and equipment, checked our weapons, tried to return to some semblance of normal life. William kept the fire burning at night despite George's assurances that there was no need, that this land was safe and had been for generations. Thomas tied nervous knots in spare rope until his fingers were raw and cramping, unable to be still. Edmund worked his knife against a whetstone until the blade shone like polished silver, his face set in hard lines, his eyes distant and haunted. I walked the edges of the camp often, staring northward though the ridge was now hidden by many miles of rolling hills. The smell was completely gone from the air now, but the memory of it clung to my senses like a stain that would never wash clean. On the second night in Ashford, one of George's hired hands, a boy no older than 16 named Peter, came running into our camp with his lantern swinging wildly, nearly dropping it in his panic. He said he had been checking the sheep in the lower field when he discovered 2 dead animals, each with those same neat punctures at the neck we knew too well. Blood drained completely, bodies left whole and unmarked otherwise. His words tumbled over themselves in fear-driven haste. He swore he had heard clicking sounds in the grass just before he fled in terror back to the main camp. We followed him immediately, carrying our rifles and lanterns despite our exhaustion, moving quickly through the darkness. The 2 sheep lay exactly as Peter had described, stiff and pale in the starlight, no tracks visible around them in the soft mud. George Hartley swore violently and spat on the ground. He looked at Mr. Thornton with eyes full of both anger and genuine fear, a terrible mixture. He asked the question we had all been dreading, "Have you brought this curse with you? Have you led this thing to my land, to my family?" Mr. Thornton answered steadily, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "No. We led nothing. It followed of its own will and intelligence. These creatures are not bound by our understanding of territory or hunting patterns." He told George in no uncertain terms to move his own flock farther south immediately, even beyond Ashford itself if possible, into the more populated regions where there would be safety in numbers and proximity to civilization. George argued briefly, not wanting to abandon his family land, but Mr. Thornton's tone left absolutely no room for debate. He said plainly that no land, no matter how good or how long it had been in a family, was worth losing animals, or family members, to things that bled in silence and displayed intelligence that rivaled human cunning. That night, none of us managed even a moment's sleep. We set torches in a wide ring around the entire camp, creating a barrier of light against the darkness. The main fire burned higher than ever before, fed constantly until sparks climbed into the black sky like desperate prayers. The sheep huddled together so tightly they seemed to merge into one massive, terrified creature, pressing against each other until their bleats turned frantic and nearly human in their distress. Around midnight, the sound came again with terrible clarity. Clicking. 2 beats, measured pause, 2 beats again. But this time it was not distant or muffled. It circled our camp in a deliberate pattern, moving from one side to another with frightening speed and coordination. First on the eastern side, then southern, then western, then northern. They were surrounding us completely, cutting off any possibility of escape. I raised my rifle with hands that trembled despite my best efforts, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The night gave us no clear shapes to fire at, no targets for our desperate defense, only that terrible sound moving through the darkness like a living thing. Edmund whispered hoarsely beside me that they were counting us, assessing our numbers and our defenses, planning their attack with cold intelligence. Thomas cursed continuously under his breath, gripping his knife with white-knuckled desperation, sweat running down his face despite the winter cold. William fed the fire until it roared like a forge, until the heat drove us back several paces, creating a wall of flame that surely nothing could cross. The circling continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, each circuit making my skin crawl, making my breath come faster and shallower. Then it stopped all at once, cutting off mid-pattern. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the clicking had been, heavy and expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. The sheep stilled completely, every head turned in exactly the same direction as if controlled by a single mind, their ears forward, their eyes wide with primal terror. I aimed my rifle at that exact spot, my finger hovering over the trigger, every muscle in my body tense and ready. Nothing moved in the visible space. The grass stood still. No wind stirred the leaves. Then that thin whistle rose again from the darkness, the same wavering, reed-like sound we had heard before, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost like language, almost like speech from something that had no right to speak. It ended on a sharp, high note that cut through the air like a blade. I thought again of the woven grass basket, of the ring of polished stone, of the alcoves containing bones and tools. I knew with absolute certainty that we were not dealing with simple beasts following instinct. We were dealing with something that marked territory, that created tools, that communicated with its own kind. Something that had measured us carefully and decided we were